In this episode, we're going to make territorial scope feel manageable by turning it into a set of calm, repeatable questions you can ask whenever data crosses borders or people live in different places. Many brand new learners assume privacy rules apply based only on where the company headquarters is, and then they get overwhelmed when they realize a single website can serve people in dozens of jurisdictions. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, mindset treats this as a program problem, not a trivia problem, because you do not win by memorizing every rule in every place. You win by building an approach that helps the organization identify which laws might apply, what obligations change when they do, and how to operate consistently without breaking trust. Territorial scope and cross-border implications matter because they can affect rights, notices, contracts, vendor choices, retention, and even whether certain processing should happen at all. By the end, you should be able to explain how a privacy program keeps its footing when the same processing activity touches multiple regions with different expectations. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Territorial scope is the idea that privacy obligations can attach because of geography, and geography and privacy is usually about people, not about buildings. A company can be physically located in one country and still trigger obligations elsewhere if it offers services to people in another region or monitors behavior there. This is why privacy programs care about where individuals are located, where services are targeted, and how data is collected and used across markets. Beginners often look for a single answer to which law applies, but a program manager looks for a method that reliably identifies likely obligations and then translates them into controls. The method matters because territorial triggers can vary, and the facts that trigger them can change as products evolve, marketing expands, or partnerships form. Territorial thinking also forces you to treat data flows as part of compliance, because you cannot evaluate scope if you do not understand where data originates, where it is processed, and where it is stored. When you learn to treat scope as a repeatable assessment, you stop reacting emotionally to geography and start building stable program routines. A practical way to evaluate territorial scope is to separate three ideas that often get blended together: establishment, targeting, and monitoring. Establishment is about whether the organization has a meaningful presence in a place, such as offices, employees, or a stable operation that connects the organization to that jurisdiction. Targeting is about whether the organization is offering goods or services to people in a place in a deliberate way, such as localized language, region-specific marketing, or local pricing and shipping. Monitoring is about tracking behavior, profiling, or analyzing activity connected to people in a place, even if the organization does not physically operate there. You do not have to be a lawyer to use this logic, because it is a program-level sorting tool that helps you recognize why a jurisdiction might claim authority. Once you identify the trigger, you can anticipate what kinds of obligations might follow, such as transparency requirements, rights handling, or cross-border transfer constraints. In exam scenarios, clues about where customers live, how the service is offered, and whether behavior is tracked are often the key to recognizing territorial scope. Cross-border implications show up when data moves or is accessed across jurisdictions, and it helps to treat movement broadly rather than narrowly. Data can move because it is stored in a different region, because a vendor processes it elsewhere, because support staff access it from another country, or because analytics and monitoring platforms ingest it globally. Many organizations accidentally create cross-border processing simply by using global service providers, even when the business itself feels local. The privacy program challenges not only where data is stored, but where processing occurs and who can access it, because access can be processing in practical terms. This is why privacy programs need reliable vendor inventories and clear understanding of how systems are configured, even at a high level. A beginner misconception is that cross-border concerns are rare and only apply to large multinational corporations, but a single cloud-based service can create international processing overnight. When you treat cross-border activity as a normal possibility rather than an edge case, you design governance that catches it early instead of discovering it during an incident or an audit. Different privacy laws can create different obligations even when the underlying goal is similar, and this is where program design becomes essential. For example, one region may emphasize a particular structure for lawful basis reasoning, while another may emphasize consumer choice mechanisms or specific disclosure requirements. One region may define rights broadly and require strong response timelines, while another may define a narrower set of rights or different verification expectations. One region may put special constraints on certain categories of data or on certain types of profiling, while another may focus more on transparency and opt-out rights. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is often referenced as a comprehensive framework that includes defined rights, accountability expectations, and strong governance concepts, while the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, is often associated with consumer rights and choices in certain contexts. You do not need to become a specialist in each law to understand the program effect, which is that obligations can differ and your program must handle those differences without becoming chaotic. The exam often tests whether you can design a scalable approach rather than treating every jurisdiction as a brand new program. A privacy program usually responds to differing laws by building a baseline and then layering additional controls where needed, because that balances consistency with legal reality. A baseline approach means the organization commits to a set of core practices that are strong enough to meet many obligations at once, such as clear notices, disciplined data minimization, defined retention rules, strong access controls, and a reliable rights request intake process. Layering means adding requirements when triggers appear, such as stricter consent requirements in one region, enhanced transparency disclosures in another, or specific assessment requirements for certain processing. This approach reduces friction because teams can follow one familiar playbook most of the time, while the program applies additional steps when needed through clear decision criteria. It also reduces risk because it prevents the organization from operating at the lowest common denominator, which is a common trust failure. A beginner mistake is thinking you must choose between one global standard or completely separate programs per region, but program maturity often lives in the middle: one program, consistent core controls, and targeted variations managed through governance. That is the practical way to survive complexity while staying defensible. To make baseline plus layering work, you need a way to classify processing activities by jurisdictional relevance, and that requires visibility into who the processing affects. In many organizations, this starts with understanding where users, customers, or employees are located, because territorial scope frequently depends on the data subject's location or residency context. It also requires understanding whether a product is offered broadly or is targeted to specific markets, because marketing and product decisions often create jurisdictional triggers. A privacy program cannot rely on guesswork here, because inconsistent treatment of users by region can create both compliance and trust problems. This is why programs often build mechanisms to tag records, accounts, or transactions with region context in a controlled way, so obligations like rights handling and notices can be applied consistently. The goal is not perfection at the individual level, but reliable categorization that supports program decisions, especially for high-impact processing. When region context is missing, the program tends to over-apply controls in some places and under-apply in others, creating operational inefficiency and risk. Exam scenarios that describe uncertainty about user locations or global reach often point to a need for better inventories and clearer scope determination processes. Cross-border processing also intersects with roles like controller and processor, because obligations and contracts differ based on who decides the purpose and key means of processing. A controller decides why and how data is processed at a meaningful level, while a processor processes data on the controller's behalf within agreed instructions. When data crosses borders through a vendor, the organization must understand whether the vendor is acting as a processor and what commitments are required to manage that relationship. This is where cross-border transfers become more than a technical concept, because the privacy program must ensure that contractual controls, oversight, and accountability follow the data. Standard Contractual Clauses, SCC, are one example of a contractual mechanism used in some contexts to support cross-border transfers with defined protections. And the high-level point is that contractual tools can be required when data is processed across jurisdictions with different protections. Even if you do not memorize every clause type, you should recognize that cross-border processing often requires specific governance steps, such as vendor due diligence, defined contract terms, and ongoing monitoring. The program manager's job is to treat cross-border as a managed risk area rather than a surprise discovery after the fact. Data localization and data residency expectations can also appear as cross-border constraints, and beginners often confuse these ideas, so it helps to clarify them in plain language. Data residency generally refers to where data is stored, while localization often refers to requirements that data remain within a certain territory for storage, processing, or both. Some environments emphasize keeping certain data types within a jurisdiction, while others emphasize ensuring appropriate protections when data is processed elsewhere. The program effect is that the organization may need to choose vendors, architectures, or operational practices that keep data within certain boundaries, or it may need to implement additional safeguards and contractual mechanisms when data moves. Even without diving into technical implementation, a privacy program manager must understand that vendor choices can create or remove cross-border risk, because vendors determine where data is processed and who can access it. A common beginner error is assuming that selecting a global vendor automatically satisfies global obligations, when in reality global vendors often create multiple processing locations that must be governed carefully. When exam scenarios describe regional requirements or customer demands about where data must reside, the correct program response often involves vendor management, contract controls, and clear processing inventories that make data location and access predictable. Rights handling becomes more complex across borders because different jurisdictions can define different rights, timelines, and verification expectations, which can create operational confusion if the program is not designed thoughtfully. A mature program avoids building separate ad hoc processes for each region because that increases mistakes and frustrates staff. Instead, it builds a consistent intake and tracking process that can route requests based on jurisdictional context and processing scope. It also builds standard decision criteria for verification, so the organization balances two risks: disclosing data to the wrong person and making rights so hard to exercise that trust collapses. When requests involve multiple systems or multiple vendors, cross-border processing can slow down retrieval and response, which is why vendor contracts and internal workflows need to support timely cooperation. This is also where documentation matters, because regulators and individuals often care about whether the organization can show what it did, when it did it, and why. The program manager should think of rights handling as a measurable program capability that must function across jurisdictions, not as a set of isolated legal obligations. Exam questions that describe delayed responses, inconsistent treatment, or confusion about which rights apply often point towards strengthening routing, record-keeping, and accountability rather than simply telling teams to try harder. Transparency and notice obligations also become trickier across regions because different laws and cultures can shape what people expect to be told and how information should be presented. A global privacy program often needs to maintain consistent core messaging while tailoring specific disclosures to meet regional requirements, which can include different categories of disclosures, different choice mechanisms, or different explanations of rights. This is not just a marketing problem, because notices are part of governance. They create the external commitments the organization must operationalize internally. If notices differ by region, internal teams must still behave consistently with those promises, which requires careful coordination between privacy, legal, product, and customer support. A common pitfall is updating a notice for one region without updating internal procedures, creating a gap between words and actions that undermines trust. Another pitfall is creating notices that are technically accurate but practically unreadable, which increases complaints and regulator attention even if the organization believes it complied. A mature program treats notice management as a controlled process with ownership, review cadence, and links to operational changes. Exam scenarios that mention confusion, misleading communication, or inconsistent disclosures often test whether you understand that transparency must be managed as a system, especially in multi-jurisdiction environments. Cross-border issues can also show up through internal access and global operations, even when the organization does not intentionally move data in obvious ways. For example, a support team in one country might access customer data from another region to resolve issues, or an engineering team might run analytics on global logs to troubleshoot performance problems. These activities can be legitimate, but they can also create cross-border processing that requires governance, especially when sensitive data is involved or when access patterns are broad. The privacy program should establish clear access principles, such as least privilege, purpose limitation for internal access, and logging and monitoring appropriate to the risk. It should also ensure that training includes cross-border awareness, because many cross-border issues are created by well-meaning employees who do not realize their actions have jurisdictional implications. When internal operations are global, governance must be clear about who can access what, for what reasons, and how those reasons are documented. This is another example of why privacy program management is not only about external compliance. It is about internal discipline that preserves trust. Exam questions that describe global teams, shared systems, or inconsistent access controls often point to governance and role clarity as the first fix, because structure is what makes cross-border practices consistent. Vendor ecosystems create a particularly dense cross-border risk surface because vendors often have subcontractors and distributed processing locations, and those can change over time without the business noticing. A privacy program must therefore manage not just the initial vendor onboarding, but ongoing oversight, including changes in processing locations, new subprocessors, and changes in how data is accessed and stored. This is where contracts become operational tools rather than legal decorations, because contract terms can require notice of changes, define acceptable processing locations, and establish responsibilities for incident communication and rights request support. The program should also coordinate with procurement and security, because vendor risk is both privacy risk and security risk, and both dimensions matter when processing crosses jurisdictions. A beginner mistake is thinking vendor due diligence is a one-time questionnaire, but cross-border complexity requires continuous visibility and periodic review, especially for vendors handling large volumes of personal information. When an exam scenario describes a vendor change, a new partner, or a surprise subprocessor, the best answer usually involves strengthening vendor oversight processes, updating inventories, and ensuring the program can demonstrate control over cross-border processing. That is how you remove surprises. And removing surprises is a central privacy program goal. Managing territorial scope also means managing conflicting requirements, because different jurisdictions can sometimes pull the organization in different directions. One region might require certain disclosures that another region treats as optional, or one region might restrict certain profiling practices that another region allows with transparency and choice. In these situations, the privacy program manager does not simply pick a side emotionally. The program uses governance to decide how to resolve conflicts in a consistent, documented way. Sometimes the solution is to adopt the stronger protection globally when practical, because that reduces complexity and protects trust. Sometimes the solution is to segment processing by region, offering different features or different data uses in different markets, because the business needs flexibility and the program must remain legally defensible. The key is that these decisions should not be made ad hoc by individual teams, because ad hoc decisions lead to inconsistency and hidden risk. Governance should define escalation paths for conflicts, and the program charter should support the authority needed to enforce the chosen approach. Exam questions about differing laws often test whether you recognize the need for structured conflict resolution rather than improvisation. A mature program accepts that not every conflict has a perfect answer, but it insists that every conflict has a managed answer. A high-value program habit is to treat territorial scope and cross-border implications as a continuous monitoring problem, not as a one-time assessment done during launch. Organizations grow, markets expand, vendors change, and processing evolves, which means the scope landscape changes even when the company believes it is doing the same thing. A privacy program should therefore have triggers that prompt reevaluation, such as launching in a new region, adding new data categories, changing analytics practices, onboarding a new vendor, or shifting support operations. This is where measurement and review cadence help, because programs can track indicators like growth in international users, changes in vendor processing locations, or increases in rights requests from certain regions. Monitoring also includes staying aware of evolving regulatory expectations, because cross-border transfer constraints and territorial interpretations can shift through guidance and enforcement trends. The program manager's goal is to avoid being surprised by scope, because surprise is what turns manageable obligations into emergency remediation. When the program has a routine for revisiting scope, cross-border issues become a known part of governance rather than a crisis. The exam often rewards answers that emphasize ongoing review and controlled change management, because that is what keeps multi-jurisdiction privacy programs stable over time. To make this exam ready, you want a simple mental move you can apply when you read a scenario about multiple regions or cross-border processing, and the move begins with identifying what actually crosses borders. Sometimes it is the individuals, meaning users are in different places. Sometimes it is the processing, meaning a vendor or internal team processes data in another jurisdiction. Sometimes it is both, and that combination can increase complexity. After that, you ask what rule sources could plausibly attach based on establishment, targeting, or monitoring, and you consider whether sectoral obligations are present due to the type of data or service. Then you shift to program controls, asking what would make the organization defensible and consistent. Clear inventories, defined roles, vendor oversight, contract terms, rights handling workflows, and notice management aligned with practice. This move keeps you from turning the question into a memorization contest, because the exam is often testing whether you know how to manage obligations through program mechanisms. When you answer this way, you choose options that strengthen the system rather than options that sound like quick fixes. That is the core CIPM discipline. Build a program that can handle complexity repeatedly, not a one-time solution for one scenario. As we close, remember that territorial scope and cross-border implications are not meant to be paralyzing, because a strong privacy program handles them through repeatable methods and clear governance. Territorial scope is about why a jurisdiction's rules might apply, often through establishment, targeting, or monitoring connected to people in that place, and understanding those triggers helps you predict which obligations may change. Cross-border implications arise whenever data is processed or accessed across jurisdictions, whether through vendors, global operations, or distributed systems, and those implications often require additional oversight, contracts, and documentation. Differing privacy laws can change rights, transparency requirements, and acceptable processing practices, which is why programs usually build a strong baseline and then layer additional controls where triggers demand it. Vendor ecosystems, internal access, and evolving business activity can quietly change cross-border exposure, so monitoring and change management are part of staying compliant and trusted. When you can explain these ideas calmly and connect them to practical program controls like inventories, governance, vendor management, and rights workflows, you are demonstrating the exact program manager thinking the CIPM exam is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.